The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone, the entire room froze. What she said next didn't just silence the Senate chamber. It made a senior senator get up and walk out. Why? Because when truth hits too hard, even power runs. The room was still eerily so. The Senate Oversight Committee hearing was underway. But something was different this time. It wasn't just the policy topic. It was the feeling that something was going to erupt. The air was thick with anticipation, as if every person in that chamber knew today wouldn't go as planned. The hearing, at least on the surface, was supposed to be routine, a high-level review of judicial ethics and accountability. Senators shuffled papers, staffers whispered from behind their folders, and cameras clicked quietly in the background. Senator Lindsey sat at his usual place, sharp in a navy blue suit, his posture straight, his face composed, used to being the voice that could steer a conversation, dominate a room, and shut down dissent. Across from him, however, sat someone who wasn't there to play politics as usual. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. There was a stillness about her, not the passive kind, but the focused stillness of someone who had studied, prepared, and measured every word before she arrived. She wasn't just another participant in the discussion. She was the storm coming over the horizon. As the meeting began, the chair laid out the agenda. Opening statements, testimony, Q&A. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until it was Crockett's turn to speak. She straightened her papers, tapped the microphone, and looked directly across the chamber, not at the room as a whole, but straight at Senator Graham, and then she said it. With all due respect, Senator, hypocrisy doesn't hide well under a polished speech. The impact of that sentence was immediate. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't delivered with rage. It was calm, precise, and devastating. Every head in the chamber turned. Eyes darted from Crockett to Graham and back again. You could hear the shifting of seats, the sudden inhale of someone caught off guard. Senator Graham didn't flinch right away. He was a veteran in these spaces, no stranger to challenge. But there was something in Crockett's tone, controlled but unapologetic, that clearly disrupted the rhythm. She wasn't here to spar. She was here to strip the mask off the moment. Graham tried to compose himself with a polite smile, replying, "I'm not sure where that's coming from, Congresswoman, but I assure you, I've always stood for fairness in our judicial system." Crockett leaned forward. "And yet, your definition of fairness seems to change depending on who's holding the gavel." Now it was real. What had been a formal discussion was now personal, direct. No sidestepping, no gentle language. Crockett was making it clear. She had receipts, and she wasn't going to bury them under pleasantries. The other members of the committee shifted uneasily. This wasn't typical. These hearings usually followed a script: questions, rehearsed answers, grandstanding for the cameras. But Crockett wasn't sticking to the script, and that's what made it powerful. She flipped open her folder, carefully highlighting examples of Senator Grant's past statements, praising judicial decisions that aligned with his views and condemning similar ones when the outcome didn't benefit his agenda. You applauded a federal ruling in June that bypassed oversight, yet you criticized a nearly identical ruling months later because it was overreach, she said, her voice even. Was it the process you disagreed with or just the result? Grant's jaw tensed. "You're oversimplifying." "No, Senator," she interrupted, not harshly but firmly. "I'm highlighting a pattern, one that the American people deserve to see." Silence. Everyone in that chamber now realized this wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. And the man who had so often shaped the room with his voice was suddenly on the defensive, facing down a woman who didn't need to yell or accuse to shake the walls. All she had to do was tell the truth, plainly and directly. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett became the most commanding presence in the room, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it. The showdown had begun, and Lindsey Graham, he wasn't ready. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted. What began as a routine hearing had quickly turned into something else, a collision of conviction and contradiction. After Jasmine Crockett's opening remarks cut straight through the typical political pageantry, everyone in the room sat up, a little straighter, Even those used to the ebb and flow of tense committee sessions knew this wasn't normal. Senator Lindsey Graham tried to recover the narrative, immediately taking the floor again after her sharp statement. His voice, calm but increasingly firm, wove through his usual themes: judicial restraint, constitutional principles, respect for institutions. He leaned on old lines, familiar ones. I've always defended the courts because I believe in their independence, he said, hands folded in front of him. I've supported judges across party lines when they respected the law. We're here to preserve that, not politicize it. He was smooth, polished, but Jasmine Crockett didn't interrupt. She let him speak, and when he was finished, she simply looked down at her binder, turned a tab and said, "Senator, I'm going to quote you your words from the separate hearings just 8 months apart." The room stilled again, in the first regarding a ruling that struck down a voting law you supported. You said, and I quote, "This judge overstepped their authority. We need accountability for these activist decisions." She paused, then flipped a page. In the second, when a ruling upheld an executive action your party favored, you said, "The courts have spoken. Their decisions must be respected." She closed the folder. The process didn't change, Senator. Only the outcome did. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even confrontational. But it was damning. Senator Graham shifted in his seat. He was no stranger to debate, but the problem with Crockett's approach was that it wasn't bluster. It was evidence, layered and undeniable. "Context matters," Graham replied, his tone tighter now. "You can't cherry-pick statements and imply motive. That's not how we conduct oversight." Crockett nodded politely. "You're absolutely right. Context does matter. That's why I came prepared with it." She slid a single document forward across the table. "This is a list of judicial rulings over the past 2 years. I've marked where you praised the decision versus when you denounced it. Each of your statements is linked to the party affiliation of the administration involved in the case." She let the silence do the rest, because the pattern was clear and devastating. The room, already tense, grew heavier. A few committee members flipped through their folders. Others looked away, knowing they couldn't refute what was laid out in front of them. Crockett had turned what could have been viewed as political theater into a data-backed dismantling of a double standard. Senator Graham, feeling the pressure, tried to regain the floor with a pivot. "We should be discussing reforms that help the judiciary, not personal attacks." But Crockett didn't take the bait. "I'm not attacking you, Senator. I'm examining consistency. When trust in the system is on the line, we don't get to pick which rules apply. Either we believe in checks and balances or we don't." That sentence landed like a hammer, because at its core, this wasn't about left or right. It was about the principle of fairness, and Crockett was making it impossible for anyone in the room to hide from that truth. A moment later, she calmly raised a printed email exchange between the Senate staffers. It was a discussion about fast-tracking a judicial confirmation hearing. Nothing illegal, but the language was telling. One staffer wrote, "Let's push this through while the majority's still with us. We can deal with blowback later." That doesn't sound like respect for judicial independence. It sounds like manipulation of timing for political gain. Graham leaned back, visibly bristling now. "That's an interpretation, not a fact." He shot back, but it was too late. The facts had already spoken, and they weren't on his side. Even those on the panel who typically aligned with Graham looked uncomfortable. Crockett had done what few dared in a room built on hierarchy and tradition. She challenged not just opinions, but the integrity behind them. And with each quiet, calculated word, she made one thing perfectly clear. This wasn't about scoring points. It was about holding the mirror up and not looking away. The room was holding its breath. What had started as a tense but controlled hearing was now on the edge of unraveling, not because of chaos, but because of one person's unrelenting focus on truth. Jasmine Crockett had laid the groundwork. Side-by-side comparisons, timelines, quotes, documents, all reinforcing a central point. But now came the part most political players try to avoid, the direct confrontation. Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime figure in the Senate and no stranger to fiery exchanges, leaned forward, visibly irritated. His voice, sharp but measured, cut through the room. "Are you accusing me of acting in bad faith, Congresswoman?" A lesser opponent might have backed off, tried to soften the blow. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She didn't blink. She looked directly at him and responded, in a tone so steady it felt rehearsed, but wasn't. "No, Senator, I'm holding up your record and comparing it to your rhetoric. If they don't match, I'm not making an accusation. I'm making an observation. It was a clean hit, not insulting, but unavoidably truthful. And it landed hard. The silence that followed was not the kind that seeks resolution. It was the kind that signals tension ready to snap. A few senators exchanged uneasy glances. A staffer dropped a pen and didn't bother picking it up. Graham shifted again, adjusting his glasses. "I've been in this chamber for over a decade, and I won't be lectured by someone twisting statements." For dramatic effect, Crockett raised a single eyebrow, then calmly reached for her notes. "Senator, I'm not here for drama. I'm here for accountability. And if a clear timeline of your own public statements feels like an attack, maybe the problem isn't the person reading them back." Gasps were audible this time. Even those trying to stay neutral couldn't help but react. This wasn't a shouting match. Crockett never raised her voice, but her calm, pointed delivery made it impossible for Graham to hide behind procedural rules or practiced sound bites. He reached for the gavel, not to adjourn, but to interject, a rare move for someone who usually commands with words alone. "Congresswoman, this committee isn't a courtroom, and this isn't cross-examination." Crockett looked up with that same unshaken composure. "Then let's stop acting like we're afraid of truth being sworn in." The room froze again. Everyone knew what they were witnessing. This wasn't political theater. It was a collision of credibility and pressure, and the pressure was cracking. Senator Graham attempted a pivot. "Let's return to the agenda. We were discussing judicial ethics, not my commentary on individual rulings." Crockett smiled slightly, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement that the game was now clear. "Exactly. And when the subject is ethics, we can't ignore patterns of selective outrage. Ethics isn't about what's legal. It's about what's right, and right now. It seems those standards shift depending on whose power is at stake." At that, the room felt like it shifted. Again, no one spoke, not out of respect, but realization. The hearing was no longer about judicial process. It was about integrity. And Crockett wasn't just presenting facts. She was forcing everyone to confront what those facts revealed. Grant's allies looked uncomfortable, uncertain whether to jump in or stay silent. One senator made a motion to move on, but the damage had been done. The energy had turned, and Crockett had control, not by force, but by truth delivered without apology. She leaned in slightly, resting her hand on the desk. "I'm not here to score points. I'm here because I've watched too many people use this chamber to protect politics, not principles. And someone has to say what others are too careful to put on the record." It was subtle. No raised fists, no shouting, just words that landed harder than any outburst ever could. And in that moment, Graham knew it. The tight grip he usually had over the flow of these hearings was slipping, not because of some scandal or outburst, but because he was facing someone who didn't fear his title. He tried one last jab. "You may want to learn how this chamber works before trying to run it." Crockett leaned back slightly and replied, "I know exactly how it works, Senator. That's why I'm not afraid to disrupt it when it stops serving the people it claims to represent." There it was, the final strike in that exchange. No raised voice, no insult, just truth, bold and bare. And in that truth, Crockett did more than confront a senator. She made everyone in that room think twice about their own words, their own positions, and their own silence. The tension had built to a boiling point. Jasmine Crockett's words still hung in the air like smoke after a controlled fire. Her voice remained calm, but her message had scorched the political comfort that often shielded those in power. She hadn't insulted anyone. She hadn't needed to. She used their own words, their own records, and their own inconsistencies. To do the heavy lifting, Senator Lindsey Graham sat stone still, jaw tight, eyes fixed ahead, but not really looking at anything. His hands rested on a pile of papers that moments ago felt like protection. Now they seemed like flimsy armor in a battle he hadn't prepared to fight. What made this moment so intense wasn't just the verbal sparring, it was the loss of control. Graham was known for steering rooms. He had built a reputation on political agility, rarely letting anyone gain an edge in public forums. But today, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just challenged him. She had flipped the dynamic, and everyone in the room knew it. A low murmur began among aides along the wall. A few senators exchanged awkward glances. The chair of the committee fidgeted nervously, silently praying someone would move the conversation back to safer ground. But it was too late. Crockett remained composed, scanning her notes briefly before delivering her next line, the one that would break the last thread of restraint. The American people aren't losing trust in the courts because of decisions. They're losing trust because the people defending those decisions only do so when they serve power, not principle. The words weren't loud, but they were clear, crystal clear. Senator Graham's fingers clenched around his pen. He shifted in his chair again. He tried to speak, opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. He didn't have a rebuttal. Not one that would work in this moment. Instead, he pushed his chair back. The screech of its legs against the chamber floor echoed sharply, slicing through the silence like a blade. Heads turned instantly. Even those who had tried to look away were now forced to face what was happening. Without a word, Senator Graham stood. He gathered his documents hastily, not carefully. A folder slipped from his grasp, scattering a few pages across the floor. An aide moved to pick them up, but he waved him off with a stiff hand. And then he did what no one expected. He walked out. No closing statement, no final jab, no explanation. Just footsteps, sharp and swift, echoing down the polished floor. It was a dramatic moment, not because it was loud, but because it was rare. Senators, especially ones of grand stature, don't just walk out of hearings. And they certainly don't walk out in silence. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her folder as if she had just finished a routine presentation. But for everyone else in that room, the weight of what had just happened was undeniable. One of the most seasoned members of the chamber had chosen flight over fight, not because he was shouted down, not because of a procedural violation, but because truth, when calmly and confidently delivered, had become too heavy to sit with. The chair of the committee cleared their throat, awkwardly trying to bring the meeting back to order. "Let's resume with the next round of questions," they muttered, their voice a few octaves lower than before. But the damage had been done. The energy of the hearing had shifted entirely. What remained was a room stunned into reflection. Even the senators who often disagreed with Crockett sat in respectful silence. Some flipped pages, some stared at nothing. Because how do you respond when someone speaks the truth so clearly that even silence feels like surrender? As for Jasmine Crockett, she didn't take a victory lap. She simply leaned into her microphone and calmly said, "I look forward to continuing this conversation. Accountability doesn't end when someone leaves the room." Boom. Quiet, graceful, unshakable. It wasn't just about a political disagreement. It was a moment of moral clarity, delivered by someone who had the courage to hold power accountable, and the strength to do it with restraint. Lindsey Graham's walkout wouldn't be remembered as an act of protest. It would be remembered as a retreat from the weight of his own contradictions and from a voice too honest to be ignored. As the sound of Senator Lindsey Graham's footsteps faded into the corridor, a deep, telling silence settled over the room. No one spoke right away, not out of confusion, but out of understanding. What had just taken place was no ordinary disagreement. It wasn't a clash of egos. It wasn't theatrics. It was a moment of truth, and truth, when delivered as Jasmine Crockett had delivered it, calmly, directly, and without apology, had a strange way of leaving everyone a little quieter. Committee Members glanced at each other. Some looked down, pretending to shuffle notes they weren't really reading. Others sat motionless, still processing what they'd seen: a senior senator leaving his seat, not because he was shouted down, but because he had nothing left to say. The committee chair attempted to reset the hearing. Let's proceed to the next speaker. But it was hollow. The room had changed. The energy had shifted completely. The scripted questions and prepared statements no longer felt important. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just revealed a contradiction in one senator's record. She had shown how fragile the entire illusion of political consistency could be when challenged with facts, clarity, and courage. And what was even more remarkable was how she did it. She didn't need to shout. She didn't insult. She didn't personalize. She simply stayed rooted in principle, holding the line even when others tried to move the goalposts as the hearing trudged on. No one dared challenge her again, not because of fear but out of respect. She had earned her space not through seniority, but through strength of character and command of the truth. When the session finally ended, the room emptied slowly. The usual post-hearing chatter was absent. There were no victory laps, no media flurries, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there was quiet reflection. A few members approached Crockett quietly. Some nodded. One senator, known for being on the opposite side of nearly every policy debate with her, leaned in and simply said, "That was powerful." She responded only with a thank you and a small nod. That was enough. She wasn't there for the applause. She was there for accountability, and in that goal, she had succeeded. But the real impact wasn't limited to the walls of the chamber. Down the hall, aides were already discussing what happened, not with spin, not with the usual he said, she said, but with genuine surprise and admiration. They had seen someone challenge power not with anger, but with conviction, and it had worked. Elsewhere in the building, junior staffers, interns, and even seasoned reporters shared one simple phrase again and again: she didn't back down. And that mattered, because in a place where political language is often filtered, calculated, and pre-approved, Jasmine Crockett had delivered something different, something rare. A message rooted in justice, in accountability, in truth. But perhaps the most profound reaction didn't come from officials or observers. It came from those who often feel unheard. The everyday people who tune out politics because they believe nothing ever changes. People who believe the truth is always buried, spun, or ignored. To them, Jasmine Crockett's actions were more than political. They were personal. She had become a voice not just in a room, but for the people who've grown tired of hypocrisy dressed in professionalism. She proved that even in the most powerful chambers, someone could still speak with integrity and force. Those in power to answer for their contradictions or walk away if they couldn't. And as for Senator Lindsey Graham, his walkout was no longer seen as a defensive maneuver. It became a symbol, a moment frozen in the memory of everyone present, not as an exit of defiance, but as an admission without words. Because when the truth is too strong to sit with, the only option left is to leave. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument that day. She held the mirror up and let the facts speak for themselves. She didn't need a gavel. She didn't need majority control. She needed only her preparation, her principles, and her voice. And with that, she delivered the most unforgettable moment of the hearing. Not with noise, not with anger, but with truth, unshaken, unfiltered, and undeniable.